Good morning. I'm so happy to be here today. I wish I could convey to you what it smells like here. The roses are everywhere, and it's cool and breezy, and it's kind of a perfect morning. I really want to thank KP of Black Belt Eagle Scout for starting the morning. I was so excited to find out that I would be sharing the morning with her, and I guess let's just get started. My talk is called Magic Beyond Matriarchy. Matriarchy is the start of me. My beloved Nana Luciana, her mother Mary, who set me on a stool at a counter, patting the tiny tortillas she laid out on her cast iron griddle before they landed on my plate. The perfect breakfast with chorizo and eggs. My teen mom Anita, her mother Dorothy, who slept in a twin bed with 3 sisters and left home for a Rosie the Riveter dormitory at 16, finally away from her father's hands, her stepmother's jealousy, her own mother's abandonment, and hidden Indigenous past. She too married young. Her husband, my grandfather, was even younger. His mother, my great-grandmother, was an abandoned, traumatized, bitter person who waited in the hall to sock her son in the stomach because he looked like his Colombian sailor dad, who locked him out of their Harlem tenement in winter if he came home even 1 minute late. She left him with a lack that made him dangerous. Matriarchy, lineage, mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers. My first novel, All of Us with Wings, is deeply rooted in my matriarchal story. It's set in the post-punk, pre-tech San Francisco of my young adulthood, a very different city than what it is today, but I think it still retains some of its magic. The book follows a 17-year-old running from a painful past who finds her way to the city. Like my protagonist, I dropped out of high school at 17 and ran away to San Francisco too, trying to find my way back to power and pleasure after abuse. I worked as a nanny, a waitress, a production assistant, and provided theft prevention and cat care at a Haight-Ashbury bookstore. If you've read my first book, you might recognize the Siamese Bookstore Cat. At 18, I fell in love with an apartment. I started working as an exotic dancer to afford its floor-to-ceiling windows, clawfoot bathtub, and tiny working fireplace. That's one truth. Another is that the difficulties that pushed me out of school and home also made it hard for me to keep a regular job. In 2005, I ran a small theater space in Portland called Milk and Honey Community Studio. And if anyone remembers that space, put it in the chat. And if you don't, I am not offended. It was a very tiny space in Southeast Portland. And with my friend, Sherry Okamura, I wrote, directed, and produced a play called Pure Gold Baby, a love letter to the women I knew in San Francisco. When I began to think about this talk, one of the lines kept going through my head. It's spoken by a character in the play who's a writer, and she's reading a line from one of her poems. And the line goes, "A carnal matriarchy embraced her, leading her from shyness to the wisdom of their art." I came to dancing for the money, but I stayed for that matriarchy, for those women. One, a fierce Salvadorian poet, became my best friend, and still is to this day. Others haunt my dreams. One bought me a pack of tarot cards, which is actually the cards I have here today. I became obsessed. I shuffled the cards over and over, laid them out, looking up their meanings, teaching myself their symbolic language, which led me to the work of feminist witches and scholars, Starhawk, Rianne Eisler, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and Louisa Teish. When I went home to my Nana, we talked late into the night and finally agreed. The Great Goddess, the Holy Virgin, different names for the same deity, the mother of us all. A few years later, when I turned 26, matriarchy became less theoretical. I'd done some healing then, moving from the city to a forested college town to be with a kind, strong partner and a 115-pound wolf dog. Between them, I finally felt safe. We moved to Portland when I was 6 months pregnant, and thanks to the magic of the early 90s Oregon health plan, we had the choice of a midwife-attended home birth. I read a million books. I'm a Virgo. Research is what I do. And I found a lineage of reclamation from anthropologists questioning Western childbirth and early parenting methods to back to nature hippie commune midwives who believed you could train yourself to experience contractions as orgasmic. Well, I never figured that one out. The women convinced me. I was having the baby at home. I mean, okay, I admit a large part of that was that I wanted my dog to be there. But also, I wanted that reclamation. Almost 30 hours of labor later, my daughter, called Luciana after my Nana, was born. In the morning when the house was quiet, I remember getting up to pee and saying to myself out loud, "You are a badass." And then I had to prove it. Starting the year before I became pregnant, I'd been in therapy around new memories I'd been having of my childhood, memories about my grandfather. The day after I gave birth, he came to visit. He held my child exactly once. One time too many. When he left, my breasts swelled and hardened, my fever spiked to 103. The midwife came. "Your body knows," she told me. When I severed my relationship with my grandfather, I lost an entire extended family, including, for many years, my mother. But I've never regretted it. Coming back to look in on us the next day, my midwife said, "The only thing you have to do is take care of yourself and this child." The way she said it crowned me. A mother, sovereign, a matriarch. 4 years later, after months of endless lobbying from her older sister, I had my second daughter, Angelica, also at home. I labored to the Beastie Boys, and that time the baby and I got the job done in a workday, 9 to 5, and there she was. In my little family of 2 daughters and a feminist man, I ruled my realm. I was soft. I was just. A benevolent matriarch. Except when I wasn't. There were times that I was rigid, times I bullied, controlled, my way or the highway. Matriarchy comes from the Latin mater and archon, mother and rule. There were times I didn't trust my own instincts or those of my partner and daughters. Whole eras where I stopped leading, where I couldn't lead, I didn't understand. Years where I felt like I failed. Trying to right our little family, we found an experimental democratic school for our kids. At the free school and at home, we began to wonder if archy, the embedded idea of rulership, was a problem no matter who was doing the ruling. Mater, for all its egalitarian, intuitive, and connective connotations, is still a binary yoked to pater, the other side of the same coin. As much as I idealized the matriarchs of my family, the roles they played felt limiting to me. Or maybe I just wasn't cut out to play them. My daughters were growing up. My body and soul were longing for something else. And that longing, that quest to find a life post-matriarchy, is the abyss where I rebirthed myself as a writer at age 40 and published my first book right on time, 10 years later. When I talk about the book All of Us with Wings, it's usually about the characters, what it's like to write a book for and about survivors, a book where a teenager is on her own in an adult world doing the best she can. I don't often get the chance to talk about the philosophical questions at the heart of the book. I created a hypothetical utopian community in the rock star family of a 12-year-old girl, and I recruited my protagonist as a fish-out-of-water nanny with a past, in part because I wanted to see what healing might look like in that world. A world where 80s queer, punk, pagan, polyamorous experiments and communal living were lived out and embraced, where desire is valued as a message from your soul about who you truly are, where goodness, idealism, and moral failing can all live in the same person, where it's difficult to say, this person is a hero, or even, this person is a villain. As I wrote, I found my stories bones in fairy tales. I like to layer them up. I used elements of a grisly fairy tale from the Brothers Grimm called The Maiden Without Hands, Aztec mythology about the goddess Xochitl, and the movie Wings of Desire. I used divination in the book, here and there. Like Caitlin said, if a character drew a tarot card, I drew the cards and put that in the book. There is a point where the cat, who is a point of view character in the book, asks his human in the way that he has, kind of by nudging the book, to throw the I Ching for him. And I threw the coins, and that reading led me to the next steps on that journey as well. So, and again, the random page in the book, in the bookstore, definitely helped me figure out what was deeper in the story and helped me go deeper into the story. A supernatural element, an element of eco-horror, arrived in the form of two ancient childlike creatures conjured by a bathtub potion, bound to avenge the wrongs of my main character Sochi's past. The book sort of exploded when that happened. I was in uncharted water. It was then that I met Portland State professor Grace Dillon. Dr. Dillon introduced me to the term Indigenous Futurism, a term she coined paying homage to Afrofuturism, which weaves in traditional knowledge and culture with futuristic ideas and settings. Dr. Dillon explained that, quote, Indigenous people are often historicized and placed in the past without imagining what the future might look like. But Indigenous Futurisms work within art, literature, and other media that place Indigenous people within science fiction is sent to change that. When I told her that my work wasn't science fiction and was set in the past, not the future, and that I'm Mexican and Colombian and not culturally connected to my own Indigenous roots, she saw no problem. Time isn't linear, and there are futurist movements in many Native and diasporic communities. As a writer, I began to understand BIPOC futurisms as a paradigm for exploring and legitimizing realities that have been considered either mythic or fantastic by the mainstream culture, a way to decolonize our stories and the way we tell them. Because for me, the bird that stops to tell you something important, or the dragonfly you saw earlier this morning, is not just something out of a fantasy or a cartoon. It's a real message that's coming to me daily in my life. So all of that was flying around my head when I started my second book, Summer in the City of Roses, which, shameless plug, comes out July 6th. So I did a thing that seemed really cool at the time that you can only really do after you've published a book and things go fairly well, and that is to sell a book on proposal, which is basically you pitch a story summary and about 100 pages. And if you're lucky, your publisher will buy the book just based on that. And all of that is great, except then you have a deadline and a whole book to write. And after taking 10 years for the first book, I had about 18 months to write the second one. When I start a story, I start with characters and a fairy tale or myth. That has been a way that's developed after I wrote my first book and wrote some short fiction and other projects that I've worked with. And so this time for Summer in the City of Roses, the characters were a brother and sister that somewhat resemble my two children, and a set of parents that have something in common with my partner and me. I added that to things that fascinate me about the Grimm fairy tale brother and sister and myths about ancient siblings Iphigenia and Orestes. And as I wrote, I began to see that I was actually writing about intergenerational trauma, and that is really a theme in both of those seemingly very different and disparate sources. And I realized that I was really trying to show a family that was like mine, a matriarchy that begins to morph and change. And I wanted to write into that space to discover what happens to its members after that transformation begins. I was also exploring place. Summer in the City of Roses is set in Portland in 1993. And as I wrote, I reached back for that sleepier city that I first came to, but I found myself pulled back even farther. I'm a California girl, born and raised, and I didn't know as much as I should have about this city's past. As I read and wrote, I began to have a sense of it, sort of then and now simultaneously, and that timeline fluidity really opened the book up for me. And even though there are only a few lines about Portland's past in the story, that research connected me to this place in a way that I've never felt, even though I've lived here for 25 years. And suddenly I find myself here in this space, and it really does feel like home, like my place. And that's the amazing thing about writing. Each book really has changed me. All of Us with Wings was about reclaiming sovereignty, but writing Summer in the City of Roses was about releasing any illusion I have left of control. That book was so stubborn, refusing to be written for months, to the point where I worried I'd have to back out of my publishing contract at one point. I was really freaking out. Then when I sat down to write, it would just sort of not feel like any there was there, until finally I had the excellent luck of getting a residency at Hedgebrook, which is a beautiful writer's colony on Whidbey Island. And I arrived there with my deadline on the last day of my 3-week residency and half the book left to write. And somehow, in the space of that time, I wrote about 45,000 words and finished the book, and was able to even go back and polish my work and send a draft that I felt really great about to my editor. As I went into that crazy process of doing something that I really honestly thought I couldn't do, I began to find a profound sense of trust in my process. Divination became the core practice in this book once I gave up any illusion of rulership. An entire chapter, which is my editor's favorite, follows the dreams of each character as they spend the night in a magical cottage in an enchanted corner of Forest Park. For this, I set up a divination station, a sort of psychic typewriter, with several tarot and oracle decks and books on alchemy, transmutation, fairy tale, and sympathetic magic, books I'd been using for research, and very quickly drew cards one after the other and then opened the books at random. Then I wrote. I usually edit each chapter a minimum of 5 times, often much more than that. But that section came out complete and whole, with the exception of a few typos, and it's still kind of amazing to me that it remains as it arrived, just right there in the published book. Before we use divination ourselves to write the end of this talk together, I wanted to tell you one more story. Once, in Mexican antiquity, in the ancient metropolis of Teotihuacan, there was a flower-crowned, spider-attended supernatural depicted in murals all over the city. When archaeologists first uncovered this amazing mural, the spider being was identified as a god. Later, when a woman archaeologist was interpreting, the being was deemed female. Finally, in 2015, the being that had been theretofore known as the great goddess of Teotihuacan was posited to be actually a gender-fluid god being. At first I thought, of course, it's in the eye of the beholder. It was there all along, but we couldn't see it. And perhaps that's true. Or maybe the deity themselves changed, evolving as we do, growing into and out of archetypes as we go. So now we're going to do a little divination to find out how to close this talk about matriarchy. As I begin, I'm going to encourage you to kind of notice where you are, where your body is in this space, in your house. Maybe you have a cup of coffee. Maybe you're outside like I am. And just to be here together in this moment. And I'm going to drop my papers and grab my cards and do a little shuffling. So this tarot deck, if you're curious, is the Crowley deck. It's an old deck. I think it first came out finally in the 1930s, but it was worked on for decades by the notorious Aleister Crowley. But really the most energetic and visual influence is by the artist Lady Frida Harris. And a little Easter egg for people who have read my first book, the band in the first book is called Lady Frida, after the creator of these cards. So as I shuffle, I think I want to think about matriarchy, and I also want to think about what might be next for us as we as a culture really are moving toward releasing the binaries and moving maybe past the idea that one person might be qualified for rulership. And also as we start to get a more fluid sense of our own interaction with the world and with our lives. So as we think about that, I'm just going to draw a card. I'm going to draw 3 cards actually, one for the past, one for the present, one for the future. It's a very basic reading, and it's something you can do yourself very easily. Even if you don't have any oracles with you, you could potentially grab a book and open it to a page and perform bibliomancy at home. And just open it up, put your finger on a sentence, and write that sentence down. And do it 3 times, and there you have a reading. Okay, here we go. Nice. Oh, wow. Okay, people. We have some wands here. Here, I'll show you this card. Can you see it? Okay. This card is the Prince of Wands, and it's a really beloved card in the deck for me. The princes are about beginning a project. They're about trying something new, and they're about having the sense of selfhood and also kind of a youthful sense of invincibility as we move out to try something new. There's also this sense of just an open heart, and I think it's very beautiful because I've always seen this particular drawing as potentially not a necessarily single-gendered being, and I also think that the lion imagery is really powerful. It's telling us to be brave and to move forward. So when I look at this card, I would say we're together trying to move forward into something new and to embrace something that's exciting, and to remember that while it's work, it's also pleasure to move into something new. And so that's what's sort of grounding our journey into that new space. The next card is this card, the Moon. This is a major arcana card, and this is for the present. And a major arcana card in a reading indicates that something is very deep and archetypal that's moving through the situation. And in this case, the Moon is really about being willing to go into that dark night of the soul. It's really about that abyss where we let go of ego and we willingly walk the moonlit path toward whatever is new. And the path leads through dark places, but it also is a very sacred journey. And I think it's a really beautifully appropriate card. We had the full moon last night, which I don't know if it kept you awake, but it always keeps me up. So for the present, I really feel like we're still in an internal space. We're not completely emerged, from the pandemic. And I think that we're also in a place of really deep reckoning that's still beginning. Carl Jung felt that the personal was political and that we need to do our personal work so that we can show up in community whole and centered and strong. And this really is telling me that we each need to individually and collectively be willing to go down that path, even if it's difficult. Just as we love this beautiful place we live and we acknowledge some of the things that have happened in its past. And then the final card is really interesting. It's the Five of Wands. It is called Strife in my deck. And you'll notice a little ritual accident many years ago. These cards are over 30 years old, so they've been through some things. What I see for this in the future is we need to get really comfortable with strife. The wands are about our energy, and we need to keep up our strength, care for ourselves, and keep striving, because I think that my own sense of personal change through a feeling that I was responsible and I had to rule, and moving to a new place where I'm not sure how to move through the world is a place of a lot more strife. I had things figured out, I thought. And, as we move forward in our lives, often we find that we didn't have it all figured out the way that we thought we did. And I think that the strife card really asks us to stand in discomfort and to tolerate the discomfort in order to move on to a different place. And I feel like that has definitely been something I've had to do. The process of writing my last book, for instance, was incredibly uncomfortable, but I really learned something. When the first Black Belt Eagle Scout song, I used to give up, I don't give up anymore, really resonated with me. And I think it's really about that. We can't, even if we used to give up, we can't give up. So I'm going to do one more card just to send us on our way today. Let's see. This is the one. Another one, the Ace of Wands. It's summer right now. We've got the heat, we've got the light, and we've got a renewed sense of energy coming back after everything we've been through. in the last year and a half. And I think that it's just a reminder to really soak it in, really fill up now, and really ask yourself, what do I desire the most? And let that lead you to the next place in your life. So I guess I just want to thank you all so much for having me, for sharing the morning with me. Putting these thoughts together was really transformative for me.